money's coming from.
I guess right. My question. I don't know I'm not looking for the mechanism so much as I am as who's responsible, and it would fall to either the municipality if it's a municipal district or a special district if we were able to create a special district. Correct?
Yes, that's correct.
If that growth, however, occurred outside of the city, it would not increase the tax base.
Well, if you want to go hypothetical, if it happened in the county, I can visualize a town council of Signal Mountain or the school board that would say, we're not willing to increase make those capital funds available, and so we're going to resolve the space problem by rationing, and off go whoever's not in perpetuity involved in the school board. You see, this is my whole problem with this whole, and I don't think we have a mechanism, and maybe it wasn't your purview to come up with an answer, but it troubles me, and that's where I'm going in this thing.
There are currently enrolled in the 3 Signal Mountain schools 115 children who do not live in Hamilton County on Signal Mountain. They live in Sequatchie County, they live off the mountain.
Okay.
So that's about 5% of capacity that you have some flexibility with. If you were to have an interlocal agreement involving Hamilton County and Walden, presumably you would want to write into that agreement an obligation to contribute to future funding needs for the community, and that would include a bond issue if you had to build a wing onto the high school.
In your proposal, you said if Walden and Signal Mountain decided, which is a logical test case, because I can't imagine Hamilton County coming in, but nonetheless, let's say Walden and Signal Mountain decided to create a joint district. Is Walden required to make the municipal contribution as well?
No, not under current law. If the law were changed so that a joint municipal school district were created, that is 2 contiguous jurisdictions, then the law would have to take into account the obligation to meet that municipal contribution. But an interlocal agreement does not create an obligation for Walden. The obligation would be the moral obligation to guarantee that your kids can go to school here forever.
So the interlocal agreement, that would have to be covered in the interlocal agreement, and Walden would have to raise taxes in order to fund their portion of that agreement.
Not necessarily. It's not that much. If you look at...
Walden is notoriously low tax.
I believe, if I remember, it was...
I don't know, notoriously probably was a bad word, I'm sorry. But let's just say low tax.
There are currently 268 students in Signal Mountain schools who live in Walden. If you multiply that, I'm just picking a number here of what the Signal Mountain town contribution would be for the 1,440 Signal Mountain students, it comes to about $300. I think it's $309 per student that the town would be required to contribute.
Okay.
If you project that to the 268 students for Walden, it comes to about $80,000. So I don't think it's going to break the bank. I'm not saying $80,000 isn't a lot of money, but it's not going to break the bank.
Okay.
It would relieve the town of Signal Mountain from that amount of municipal contribution.
But again, and I know I'm being argumentative, I apologize, but this part of this thing really gives me a problem. That's based on the minimum contribution.
Right.
If it were greater than that, based on capital needs, of course it would be proportionate, but it would be higher. Yeah, it could be.
Depending on how the
agreement was big it is. Yeah,
it's true.
And the interlocal agreement is all there is to ensure that the contract is held.
That's correct.
Students from the county, if they didn't participate, students who lived in the county who moved to Signal Mountain thinking they were going to be in that school district because it was 37377, theoretically could lose their position in this. They could start in the first grade and not make it through the 12th grade in the.
That's the current situation as well. When Hamilton County schools are overcrowded, that is the first thing they do is move students rather than build schools. And so it's, that is,
I understand.
I don't think that there's any, I don't think they have any guarantees as it is.
I think John earlier addressed that. He made the comment that if that's the case and you live out in the county now and the schools up here fill up, is it more likely that HCDE is going to spend the money to expand our schools, or is it more likely that a local school board who's dealing with the issue is more likely to spend the funds to expand the school? So I think you have to look at what presently will happen too, and the potential down the road. Because at that point, you could run in, if you're in the county back there, you could be bused off the back of the mountain.
If it's a Signal Mountain municipal district,
right,
I can see a Signal Mountain municipal district acting in its own best interest rather than the collective interest of
absolutely. I agree with you.
And that part makes
That's an issue.
That really worries me.
Oh yeah, worries me too. I really think because the council has, the committee has put out 4 options to work around this issue that we've said from the beginning is we need to include everybody. Mm-hmm. And to me, the one that seems to be the cleanest from what I've read, and I'd like to hear your comments on this, is the change of to an exemption to the state law for a special municipal district. Because that seems to solve, for that one, there are other issues that need to be addressed, but for that one, that's your point, is it would allow everyone in those areas to vote on the referendum. It would allow everyone to create a school board where they could have representation from those areas, and it would allow everybody, students, same status, to go to the schools.
And what obligate them to fund it.
Right. Interlocal agreement doesn't, to your
Absolutely.
point, I agree.
Yeah.
The interlocal agreement is not the best option of those 4 that were presented by the.
It is the easiest, but it's not.
But
I don't think it's-
even a change in state law would require that Hamilton County Commission opt in.
Okay. Well, right. I'm not arguing either way. I'm just saying, I'm making an observation on the 4 options you gave us. To me, that seems to be the cleanest. Doesn't mean the other ones wouldn't work.
Right.
That just seems to be the cleanest.
I think one of the things that we need to keep in mind, one of the broader issues is that the last public comments by HCDE is that they're going to continue to serve, if a Signal Mountain school district was established, they would still have a Hamilton County school presence up here on the mountain. So it becomes very muddy in terms of who's serving who. And
to your point, that may be the best case scenario for the unincorporated folks. If there is an open enrollment at Signal, they have the option to go to Signal, but they also have the option not to go to Signal. I mean, I'm not trying to project what people's needs, but you then have options.
While we're on the subject of interlocal agreements, one exists right now with 4 entities. Is that correct? Hamilton County, the unincorporated Hamilton County Department of Education, Walden, and Signal, correct?
Yes.
So let's say for some reason Hamilton County decided, we're fine, we want you guys to do this for whatever reason tomorrow that happens. That interlocal agreement still exists, and there are bond issues that still exist for the county on the property up here. Has that money been figured into this budget in any way? Because that would still have to be paid off somehow. Am I incorrect that it exists?
I don't want to give you a legal
I'm happy to
opinion
be corrected.
because I'm not the lawyer representing Signal
No,
Mountain.
but I'm asking about
But
money.
the answer to your question is that the bond issue would continue to be paid by what we call the obligor, that is by Hamilton County, and the payment would be made using taxes paid by Signal Mountain, Walden, and unincorporated area residents, as well as residents of the rest of the county. The county remains obligated on the bond because it is the debtor on the bond. In other words, the obligation doesn't transfer to the new school district. It remains with the original debtor.
Is that
That
the way
is
you'd
correct.
explain it? Okay. Thank you. But the interlocal agreement still exists, which, well, I guess Signal Mountain, we've just paid ours off.
Walden paid theirs off originally. I think they just, and we've paid ours off this past year.
So does anyone think that the interlocal agreement would just disappear without litigation?
This year.
That, and again, maybe this isn't fair for you guys. This is a question.
And I don't necessarily, if it is, because it goes back to Dick's point, interlocal agreements aren't.
Use the mic.
In perpetuity. I mean, it's one way or the other, but that's not. Yeah, I think we need to, again, focus on asking the questions to clarify the report, and then let us go back to do what we're paid, what we're paid the big bucks to do. Right? Oh, we're not paid.
As far as enrollment, though, if you look on page A30 of Exhibit A, there's a summary of enrollment, and you can see that it has declined. So we've actually, the percent decrease between 12-13 to 16-17 overall in our district has decreased by 5%. So it would take a 5% increase to match the.
You're projecting a population decrease.
No, I looked at 5 scenarios. That was one of them.
Okay.
But these are actual. This is actual data of what has actually happened in our schools.
Why is it decreasing? I can answer the question. I mean, that just doesn't make sense.
No, I've got the date in mind. In 2009, that was the second year of Signal Mountain Middle High School existing. I asked the principals of both Thrasher and Nolan gathered the data for me. The year prior to Signal Mountain Middle High School opening, Thrasher and Nolan combined sent 37% of their students to private schools, primarily Baylor McConnell GPS, Notre Dame, Chattanooga Christian, 37%. The year after Signal Mountain Middle High School opened, that percentage dropped to 7%. My last year's principal at Signal Mountain Middle High School, we had over 13. In fact, the data there is on A30. In 2013, there were 1,312 students. That number declined through 1311, 1281, and in 1617, which was last year, it was down to 1221. So the enrollment in that school declined actually by nearly 100 students. And the reason, as the newness wore off, as the economy improved, people on the mountain began to send their kids back to private schools. And so after Thrasher, after Nolan, in fact, the enrollments of Nolan, it's dropped back a little bit. Thrasher has actually pretty well maintained. But the biggest enrollment drop was middle high school. When students reach that age, then parents are beginning to look more toward sending their kids in private education.
I want to piggyback on that, because the thing that scares me more than Dick's scenario on growth, because I think if you have growth, you have the capacity and you're going to have the excess per student to have the capital to do something. I think it scares me if we go the other direction. To me, that is a bigger, you don't have the revenue then to provide the resources. If we continue to have a reduction, then I think it's more likely that the municipality is called upon to guarantee and come up with money. And that's what really scares me about this situation in this scenario.
I think the answer is you have a municipal school board, a district school board, that looks to the future and sees a decline in enrollment and develops an attendance policy or revises its attendance policy to attract students from out of district. You can do that by creating a magnet school. You can do that by sending a bus down the mountain to bring kids up, have a sister school that you have some reciprocal arrangement with. If you have quality schools, people will want to come here.
I've also been remiss in recognizing Councilwoman Speak, who was the liaison to this council and has done a tremendous amount of work on this along with the council. Thank you for your efforts, and you have not had a chance to ask any questions. Would you like to? I mean, you've been closer than anyone, so you probably know more than anyone, but.
I don't have a whole lot of questions, simply because I've spent so much time with each of them individually and also as the committee. But I am very interested in hearing the rest of the council members' questions, and we'll chime in.
Dan? Dick, Dan?
Yeah. The savings thing, excuse me, I don't know.
Where's it?
I'm going to have to use round numbers, $300,000 from MEF, $300,000 from the supply fund, the parent fund, $600,000, which transfers over to the operational funds, is picked up, and it is paid for out of that 1.9 in savings, reducing that savings to 1.2 million. Somewhere we picked up a retention bonus. We picked up some other things that were mentioned that don't exist today. Where does that revenue to pay for those additional expenses come from? Does it come from the savings and further reduce the amount of savings from 1.2 to something less than that?
Only in year one. Those are startup costs. Those are one-time only startup costs. The state requires that you establish a rainy day fund of 3% of your operating budget.
Okay.
So you set aside $650,000, put it in the bank, and it's done. The retention bonuses are paid
a one-year
only.
thing.
The other startup costs, there were some technology costs that we figured would be necessary to upgrade the equipment that currently exists. There were some fixtures that might need to be replaced. There was some software that had to be used for the HVAC system. Those are one-time fixes.
Okay.
After the year one budget, those are gone.
And the assumption is in that 1.2 is kind of there, and we don't want to touch it. We carry it over and assume that we're going to accumulate
That would be up to a school board to decide, but then the 1.2 would either be available to carry over or to allocate to special
another
programs.
purpose if it came up. Okay.
To quality improvements.
Yeah. Oh, that was the other thing. I made a note here and I didn't even read it. The retention bonuses and the later start time, which is an additional cost. What pays for that?
The later start time is a recurring cost.
Right. So that would come out of that 1.9 million also.
Correct.
Yes. Okay.
On that 1.9 million, Dick is okay. On that 1.9 million, was that figured in after or before the county has proposed their tax increase?
The county tax increase, it depends on how they choose to use their funds. If the $100 million is used for capital projects, there is no signal, like if it happened right now, and that money is allocated in bonds for capital projects, there would be no effect on this budget projection. Earlier in the year, they talked about they requested an additional $24 million for I believe, for their general purpose fund to pay for different items in a general purpose budget. If that was allocated, then that would increase the county funding, and the Signal Mountain portion would increase respectively based on the pro rata share.
How much would that be?
Thank you.
$1.3 million.
1.3 above the 1.9?
No, 1.3 above the 20 million.
Okay.
It would be,
You have no expenses offsetting it, so if 25% of that were to be used as, 25% of that were to be used as operational, Signal would get
1.38 million with no comparable increase in expenses. That's just a revenue increase.
So that would push the excess to 3 million? Am I?
That's right. 3.2.
Amy, a question for you. All right, the surplus, did our budget not already include extra buses to change the start time?
In the budgets, no, we had a value-added budget where we were taking all in an earlier version, and for simplicity's sake, we've just gone to more of an apples-to-apples comparison. But those items are all listed in the report, the items that the committee had looked at for consideration, but we took them out we took off of, it was a lot to look at, let's put it that way. To simplify what is being presented, we're doing more of the apples to apples, and then the Hamilton County with the estimated, with the MEF and supply fees. The busing was one of the things that we looked at as a value-added option, but as a committee, we decided that that is not our job to determine what to do with any budget surplus. That's really up to a school board. So those have been presented in the report. Do you remember? Was it page 10 possibly? Excuse me. Page 10. It lists some of the ideas that were generated by the committee. But again, because we have no authority to implement any of these changes, it's all ultimately up to a school board. We chose to list them in the budget, and the additional busing was one of them.
I guess the question I'm asking is that surplus could be reduced dramatically depending on school board decisions then. There's no guarantee that.
That is correct.
Yeah.
I mean, depending on what the school board, how the school board would choose to allocate those funds.
Yeah, I know $1 million sounds like a lot, but it's not.
5%.
A procedural question. How did you determine, and what is the size of the central office staff for this new system?
I'll answer that question. Based on my experience, I was superintendent of 2 small systems in Georgia. Both would be approximately the same size as Signal Mountain, would be about 2,400 students. So I just recreated a central office organization that existed in those 2 systems. The state, when we sent it to the state, they pretty much said, okay, looks good. When we presented it to Hamilton County, they recommended we add 2 positions.
At that time, it was 1 position. It was adding a human resource position. And you can see the central office organizational chart is on page A7 of Exhibit A.
So the only change in what I recommended was what Hamilton County recommended we add an additional position. They felt like it was a little bit lean. And so the chart on page A7 is the proposed Signal Mountain School District Central Office organizational chart.
So I've seen some numbers since then that I haven't verified, just to tell you that straight, that showed staffs of almost twice that, central office staffs of almost twice that in Tennessee for schools of similar size.
And we kind of addressed that situation, and Hamilton County is the same situation, to be honest with you. The longer a school system is in operation, the more bloated a central office becomes. And we looked at Sequatchie County, which has 2,300 students, would be very similar. We looked at Alcoa City, which has about 1,800 students. We looked at Lenoir City, which has about 2,400 students. Those were three systems that have the number of students that would be projected in a Signal Mountain district, and they're very similar. If you want to bloat a central office, put a bunch of positions in there. If you want to operate it efficiently, then look at what you really need to have and establish it in that manner. We did that, and then at Hamilton County's suggestion, we added one additional position.
I have several questions. I'm going to get a couple in if that's okay. Can you walk through the state law on how we qualify on the number of students? I know it's an either or, and it's a legal question. Can you do that?
While he's looking for that, let me, Dan, if you don't mind, I'm going to go back to one of the previous questions that you asked, and I'd like to answer it on my behalf, all right? You asked about going into the process, whether we wanted to prove viability, or whether we wanted to essentially establish whether it was viable or not. All right, I served on the ad hoc committee. The ad hoc committee met for 3 or 4 months, did the best we could to come up with some figures, presented them, and so forth. On the application that I filled out, and I believe I'm the only one that stated this, on the application that I filled out to become a member of the Viability Committee, I stated up front that I believed it was viable based on the information I received through the ad hoc committee. However, I don't believe the ad hoc committee had the opportunity, the time to study the issue as well as the Viability Committee has. And if there's any data that comes forward or any information that comes forward, I would certainly be willing to change my mind.
So I want to respond. Thank you first, because I made notes on every application and spent a lot of time looking at those. And I felt yours was as honest as it could be, because you stated where you were coming from. I remember laughing and thinking what a Lake Wobegon town we are in, because everyone appears to be neutral on everything and looking at the majority of them, and I appreciated that. And I had even had you down as a suggestion, someone who I thought would be good on the committee because of your experience and because you stated honestly what you wanted to do. In the process of pulling the committee together, I wish we could have had more people who perhaps would have come from a default, I don't think this is a good idea position. So hence my question as to proving versus determining, and also seeing the way Charlie his comments have been demeaned. I feel that he's been demeaned in this process, and that's made me uncomfortable, and I don't like to see that happen in a committee of people volunteering and putting in the amount of time that's gone into this.
Well, one final thing on
Can I go back to my question? Is that okay? All right. Thank you.
You asked about state law regarding the size of a prospective school district. Rules of the State Board of Education, Chapter 0520-1-8.01, requirements for creation or reactivation of city school systems. No city school system shall be created or reactivated for the purpose of operating a system of public schools unless such school system shall have a scholastic population within its boundaries that will assure an enrollment of at least 1,500 pupils in its public schools, or which has at least 2,000 pupils presently enrolled in the proposed school system.
Do we qualify on both? Or
We should qualify on both. Signal Mountain, the town of Signal Mountain currently has approximately 1,750 children of school age. That's between 5 and 17 years of age, according to recent census data. We have 1,425 of those children enrolled in Signal Mountain Public Schools currently, but the number of children of school age exceeds 1,500. And
That's the determining
we
factor.
have that's a determining factor.
What's that?
And we have at least 2,000 pupils presently enrolled in the school system.
Okay. Next question. Can you legally address if in-kind, you talk about in-kind basis, that the town could potentially give in-kind to meet their $438,000 obligation and or split between the other communities. Can you discuss your legal basis that you believe in-kind is acceptable?
I raised that question with Attorney Phil Noblet, and I think that's a question that needs to be addressed to him.
So continue. Additional clarification on that.
I would ask him for the clarification on that.
Thank you. I have a few others. Does anybody want to jump in with one? Go ahead.
I know that we've discussed this as a committee, but there's a lot of people here, and I've been approached quite a bit about special ed. Could you go into a little bit more detail about how that's being addressed in the budget?
Certainly, just a moment. During our the process of completing our research, that was one of the biggest, probably the biggest concerns and the most questions that we asked of Hamilton County. We asked Hamilton County quite a few questions, and I would say the majority of those were based on special needs to ensure that we could meet or exceed the current level of funding for those programs. So we asked a lot of questions, we asked a lot about the buses, bus attendants. For each special ed bus, there has to be an assistant on the bus. We learned that children are not only educated on the mountain, but they're also educated off the mountain through programs at Orange Grove, Siskin, the Dawn School, and I believe we also may have some students that go to Red Bank Elementary to take care of their needs. So the needs of the special ed students were very important. They were a priority during this investigation, just to ensure that we were capturing the, I was looking at primarily at the budget for making sure that we were capturing the expenses for those services. We looked into physical and occupational therapists, and so we really tried to ask as many questions as possible to make sure that there were speech teachers, physical and occupational therapists, and all of the current off the mountain services could be retained. We also asked about summer programs. There's some children who are bused to summer programs for the county, and so we really tried to ask as many questions to make sure that our bases were covered. We have a lot of special children, and they're definitely an asset to our school. I know that the buddy program at Nolan is such a special program, and the kids mean a lot.
The funding is the same, right? I mean,
Yes.
there's
We
a
tried
kid
to,
is a kid in a sense. I mean, whether they have special needs or not, the funding path is virtually the same?
No,
yes?
no, on the state funding formula, there is a different funding allocation for children with special needs.
Okay.
And that was one of the pieces of the puzzle that was a little bit difficult to find, because it is, we had to get the information directly from the county. The funding formulas take into account not only the fact that children have special needs, but there's 9 different options for each of those children. And it each comes with a different funding formula. So the state funding is allocated that way, and then we try to capture. So that was captured on the in the BEP formula, and then on the expense side, just trying to ask as many questions and receive those responses from the county. And the county was very gracious in providing the cost for those programs.
Oh, you think you've got it pretty well captured as far as what
yes, the state, both the
cost would
state
be?
and the county have looked over the budget.
What would disrupt your calculation? Anything? I mean, if a disproportionate number of kids had to go to Orange Grove, would that change things? I mean, is there a potential there for?
Why would, in other words, there's always potential for certain things.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't foresee the percentages of students being served in certain areas changing. As long as those students are still in our system, they will still be served in the same manner.
Okay. Yeah, but okay. And
Does that answer your question?
But things do change. I have a special needs granddaughter, so I have, and she goes to Orange Grove, and I think that probably is incurs a premium cost for her on Hamilton County's budget. And I just wonder if a lot of those kids from here went to Orange Grove, does that bust the budget? And I don't mean, but that was a poor choice of words. Does it disrupt your? I go to Charlie and say, is there a risk that does it change your conclusions, I guess?
When I was actually surprised in the research, because that's why I asked so many questions, is because that was my biggest concern, is because those services are so needed, you want to make sure that you can duplicate or exceed what's currently being provided. And that's why I asked so many questions. But when I received the responses, I was actually surprised on a per student basis. And if you give me just a minute, I can tell you, I mean, I can give you an idea, but it was not as much as I would have anticipated. And I'd be happy to point that out in the budget for you at some time.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I'm not trying to.
No, I understand. That was my concern too.
But I'm looking for, any time you make an estimate of what the future is going to be.
Right.
You know, what is it that's going to change the circumstances and I'm just, if we're going to go down this road, I think we need to think in those terms too, not beyond the factual and think in the realm of, possible or hypothetical, and I guess I'm looking for that possibility and quantify it if possible. I don't know if that's even likely. I have to say that I'm so impressed by this report. I mean, we have taken you all way off of the core, and I think part of that is because we feel so comfortable with what we have here that we're comfortable in going beyond that and poking around and seeing if we can go beyond that. But what you have presented to me personally is just very impressive. I just wanted to tell you how much I appreciate it. I'm very grateful. Thank you.
I want to reiterate that, but I'm going to rain on the parade a little bit because I got a couple questions. On page 16, last paragraph, second to last line, I believe operating expenses should be operating revenues. Is that accurate? Where are you, Chris? Page 16, last paragraph, second line at the end, where it says operating expenses. I think the intention there was to be operating revenues, or am I misreading that? Together, the state and county funds derived from tax revenues form the basis of the general purpose school fund, are the main source of operating expenses, is what the state says. It should be revenues, correct? Okay. Okay.
I think it applies to both. It's the main source of operating revenues, and that's the main area of outflow
Okay.
of costs.
And then I did want to get your understanding on page 22 and 24 regarding the SRO officer. You have 65,000 attributed by the town at this time, and we have stopped that. So that is no longer, we are no longer funding that position. The county has taken that over. We stopped last December, I believe. Is that last December?
It was, that was mostly a placeholder figure because it shows up in both revenue and expenses, so it is a net zero.
That doesn't change the 438 or any other obligation that we have as a town.
It doesn't change the total. We had it split up between an SRO and a municipal contribution, with the total being 438. So the 438 would stay the same.
All right, we have gone well over an hour and a half. Thanks for everybody's patience who remain. If we have any other major questions, we'll get them out, but I'd like to try to start wrapping this up and be sensitive to everyone's time. And again, reiterate what Dick said on our appreciation of your service to the town. Anybody else?
A year ago, I couldn't even have an intelligent conversation about this, so I appreciate being educated on these issues.
Anyone else?
Well, I would like to ask Charlie if, hey, your opinion, your dissent wasn't read here, it was just addressed, and you haven't had any direct questions. Is there anything that you'd like to say because I think as a council we need to maybe hear a summary of where you stand on this thing and on the process as well?
Well, I don't personally characterize it as a dissent. I characterize it as additional information. I personally think that the budget document, as it stands, based on the assumptions in the document, is excellent. I have no qualms about that. I have some qualms about some of the assumptions behind it, but the document, as John and Amy have said, it's exceedingly detailed and very good. The issues I have deal with the riskiness in my mind. I'm relatively risk-averse person, deals with the risk of, and again, of some of the issues that are in the document in terms of school buildings, lawsuits, dual school districts, things that we just don't know the answer to right now. We could go around the table and some would say one thing and some would say another. There's, in the years that, I'm not a lifelong educator, I'm a lifelong financial analyst. There's, in my mind, inherent risk in the town of Signal Mountain potentially taking on an obligation of a financial entity that is about twice the size of the town from a financial basis. There's a risk of the larger the financial entity, the lower amount of risk for that entity. And in other words, Hamilton County Department of Education with a 300 some odd budget by definition, is able to take care of unintended consequences, things that just come up, just by virtue of their being larger than, say, a potential Signal Mountain school district that's smaller. That's just the way it is. It just gives me pause, and I would have liked to have investigated these a little bit more, but before I think these are issues that the council needs to just weigh in terms of how you look at the budget document, and look at the states of nature that might come up or might not come up. There's a potential that the budget could go into deficit. There's a potential that it could be twice the size. I mean, it's these are issues that that can happen. But it's the risk of at various levels that I think we all need to make sure that we are okay with if we decide, if the council decides to proceed. But again, I don't view it as a dissent. I just view it as additional information for consideration for the council.
Thank you, sir. Just, again, thank you to the audience for your interest and participation. Just to give a sense of my concept, I don't speak for the council where we're going to go from here. This issue will be on our Friday agenda meeting, which will be at 1 o'clock, right? 1 o'clock this Friday, where we'll discuss potential paths forward. In my opinion, I don't think we're anywhere near bringing this to a vote or a conclusion. I think there's a lot more information that we still have to gather. I think there's a lot more public input that now that we have the facts on the table that we have to engage in. So I don't want anybody to be panicked that this is going to go to a vote immediately, because that is not the intention at all until we engage everyone and get proper feedback and input. But thank you all again. This is obviously a very important issue to everyone, and your time and efforts are very much appreciated. With that, I'll adjourn the meeting. Thank you.